Feedback is one of the most contentious issues in all of formative assessment. And as you've heard, the crucial issue about feedback is that it moves learning forward, that feedback is forward-looking rather than backward-looking. And this was very clearly illustrated in a study undertaken by Ruth Butler and her colleagues. They had a group of about 260 students in 12 classrooms in Israel. And this analysis focuses on the highest and the lowest achieving students in each class. Now, what's important to remember about this study is that it was very well controlled. So in each one of the 12 classrooms, the students got the same teaching from the same teachers, working to the same aims and using the same curriculum materials. The only differences between the classrooms was the kind of feedback they were given as they worked. So in 4 of the classrooms, as the students worked, they were given scores. When the books were taken in, the worst piece of work was given a score of 40, the best piece of work was given a score of 99, and the others were scaled in between. In 4 of the classrooms, the students were just given comments as they worked. They weren't great comments, they were just things like, you thought of a lot of good examples here, maybe you could think of a few more. And in the 3rd batch of 4 classrooms, the students got the score and the comment side by side. So what happened? Well, this is shown on slide 25. The students given scores made no progress. The post-tests they took, they got the same scores as the pre-tests, so they learned nothing. And when the researchers asked the students, do you want to do more work like this? The students who got high scores said, yes, please. And the students who got low scores said, no, thank you, let's do something different. The students given comments made a 30% improvement from the pre-test to the post-test. They didn't know that, of course, because they hadn't seen any scores. But when the researchers asked the students, do you want to carry on with this? The students who got high scores and the students who got low scores both wanted to carry on. So the question I'd like you to discuss with your colleagues or your neighbours is this: what do you think happened for the students given both scores and comments? So if you look at slide 26, here's a reminder of the outcomes for the other students. So the students given scores made no progress, high scores were positive, low scores were negative. Students given comments, 30% improvement in achievement, and all the students positive. So what do you think happened for the students given both scores and comments? Take 3 minutes to discuss this in your groups. Okay, so typically the responses are quite varied. Optimists tend to go for A. It's the best of both worlds, isn't it? That you'll get the gain of the 30% and you'll get the positive attitudes. Many teachers think that B will happen, that you'll get a gain of 30%, but the attitudes will be polarized. So the gain of 30% comes from the comments, but the negative effect of the scores makes the students with low achievements feel less positive about the work. C is an averaging effect the other way. The rationale behind C is that they get no improvement because of the scores, but somehow the comments make them feel okay about getting a bad score. And not surprisingly, C is the least often chosen because it doesn't seem very likely. And D is the worst of all possible worlds. It's just the same as the score. And what many people are mystified and surprised to discover is that in this experiment, when it was conducted, D is what happened. The students given both scores and comments did no better, did exactly the same, in fact, as the students just given scores. This is curious because across the world, the most common form of grading practice is that we give kids scores or grades and a comment. And this study, and others like it, this is not an isolated example, show that if you're going to give children carefully detailed diagnostic comments and then go and put a score or a grade on it, you're wasting your time. Because the children who get the high scores don't need to read the comments, and the children who get the low scores don't want to. You'd be better off just giving a score. They won't learn anything, but you will save yourselves so much time marking. Now, an illustration of what's going on here is found in another study on slide 27 by the same research team. And here there were 8 classrooms. In one classroom, as they worked, the students were given comments. In a second classroom, they were given grades. In a third classroom, they were given written praise. And in the fourth classroom, they were given no feedback whatsoever. Now, the students in groups 2 and 3, the students given grades and praise, made no more progress than the children given absolutely no feedback at all. The only students who made significantly greater progress were the students given comments. So much for this idea that children need to know where they are. Well, of course, children know where they are most of the time. What they don't need is to be reminded of it all the time. And yet, if they can get it, they want that feedback. So, in many schools, we've created a trap. Children won't work unless their work is given a grade. And yet, the grade is harmful. It's as if they are the junkies and we are the pushers. We have to find a way of getting our kids unhooked off grades. And I don't know how we do it, whether it's a course of methadone or going cold turkey, I just don't know. But I'm very clear that certainly for children in primary school and early secondary school, grades are completely unnecessary. We'd be far better off just writing reports to parents about what the kids can do and what they can't do, because of the way that reports direct attention. In the previous study, where students in the 4 classrooms where students were given both the scores and the comments, clearly the first thing that a student looks at when they're given both a score and a comment is the score. What's quite interesting is what they look at next, and it's not the comment. When they're given both a score and a comment, what they look at second, of course, is somebody else's score. What you get. And as soon as you get the what you get in your classroom, you can forget the learning. Because now the ego is engaged and all the students' energy is directed towards protecting the self-esteem. And that's what this study showed very clearly. Giving grades and giving praise had no impact on students' achievement, but it did increase the level of ego involvement. The level of ego involvement in the classrooms given grades and praise was higher, whereas the level of ego involvement in the classrooms given comments was the same as in the classrooms given no feedback at all. So the crucial issue here is to keep the ego out of learning, and this is very powerfully illustrated in the study shown on slide 28. Now, I've just chosen 2 studies so far, and you could accuse me of picking 2 studies that suited my point of view, and that's why this study is so powerful. 2 researchers at Rutgers University, Kluger and Denisi, decided to look at every single study that had ever been done on feedback. They went back to 1905. They found over 3,000 research reports and studies on the effects of feedback, 2,500 journal articles, and about 500 technical reports. Unfortunately, some of these weren't very well conducted or reported. Some of these studies had only a single participant. In some cases, they'd given some students feedback, but they changed other things. So it wasn't possible to work out whether it was the feedback or something else that was changed. In other studies, there wasn't a control group. And so they eliminated all the studies where it wasn't possible to attribute the outcomes unambiguously to feedback. What they were surprised to discover was that out of the original 3,000 studies, only 131 were methodologically rigorous. And out of these 131 studies, they found that on average feedback did increase performance. But what they were very surprised to discover was that in 50 out of the 131 studies, 38%, giving people feedback actually made their performance worse. In other words, in almost 2 out of every 5 carefully controlled scientific studies, giving people feedback made their performance worse than had you given them no feedback at all. You'd been better off shutting up in 38% of the cases. And this obviously puzzled the researchers greatly, and they decided to investigate what was significant about the feedback where it lowered performance. And what they found was that it was basically ego involving. You know, you're a good employee, you're a bad employee. You get a raise this year, you don't get a raise this year. You get an A, you get an F. And what they found was that people who got high evaluations didn't get any better, and those who got low evaluations got slightly worse. The feedback that was effective in raising performance had 2 characteristic features. One, it told people what to do. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it told them how to go about it. In other words, feedback contained a recipe for future action. So in terms of our classroom practices, slide 29 details some practical techniques we can use to promote more effective feedback. The big idea here is that feedback should cause thinking. If your feedback causes a thinking reaction, a cognitive reaction, then there's a chance that some learning might happen. If your feedback causes an emotional reaction, then there is no chance that learning will take place. So the teacher's goal must be to keep the feedback focusing on the thinking rather than the emotional reaction. So one way to do this is comment-only marking or grading. It's still difficult to get the students to read the comments, however. One teacher that I worked with in North London, called Charlotte Kerrigan, she has been using comment-only marking for a long time, but she still wasn't happy with how much attention the students were giving to her comments. So she decided to try something different. So the students had done an essay on Shakespeare, and rather than writing the comments at the bottom of the student's essay, she wrote them on strips of paper. And each group of 4 students received back their 4 essays and the 4 strips of paper, and their task was to match the comments to the essays. And that is smart, because what she's managed to do is to slow down the emotional reaction. So when a student picks up one of those comments, they're reading it to find out what it says, not what it says about them. So slowing down that emotional reaction so that students are focusing on the content rather than what it says about them as a person is an important first step in creating good feedback. Focus grading. Don't comment on everything. Don't correct everything that's wrong with students' work. I did an interview with a girl in year 5 or 6, I think it was, and she said something that really quite surprised me. She said, when you get a lot of feedback, it means your work wasn't very good. And I said, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, if you do really good work, you just get A, excellent. But if your work isn't as good as that, then there's lots of teachers' comments all over your work. So in other words, this student had come to believe that the more feedback you got, the worse your work must have been. In other words, good kids do not get feedback. So we thought about how we could actually deal with this. And one approach that a history teacher has been using is to put numbered circles at various points in the student's response. And at the bottom, the teacher writes out 3 questions, question 1, question 2, question 3, relating to each of the numbered circles in the student's text. And then when they come into the lesson, they know that the first thing they're going to have to do is answer those 3 questions. Doesn't matter whether you're the slowest kid in the class or the most able kid in the class, every lesson, when your books have been marked, starts with responding to the questions the teacher has asked. And what that teacher has managed to do is to get rid of that idea of feedback as being an autopsy or a post-mortem, and now feedback is what's next. So actually students know that when they come back, their books having been marked, they will sit down and they will answer those 3 questions. If you give kids scoring rubrics or scoring guides or mark schemes, then make sure that you refer back to these things when you're giving feedback. Many teachers give kids feedback that doesn't refer back to the marking scheme or the scoring guide that they've earlier shared with the students. Now, these work very well in text-based subjects, but as maths teachers and science teachers have said to us, you can't do this in maths, because if you tick 15 of these equations as correct and put a cross next to 5 others, the students can work out for themselves they got 15 out of 20, whether you tell them or not. So we suggested that they should instead say to the students, 5 of these are wrong. You find them, you fix them. In other words, feedback is leaving some work for the students to do. Rule 1 of teaching is never work harder than your students. Corollary of rule 1 is feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. I don't know a single teacher whose students spend as long taking on board the feedback they are given as it takes the teacher to provide it, and that needs to change. Feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. And this technique of 5 of these are wrong, you find them, you fix them, was taken then up by language arts teachers and English teachers. On a final draft of a piece of writing, you can put a dot in the margin every time there's something that needs correction. For the weaker students, you can put P for a punctuation error, G for grammar, S for spelling. But the important point is you're leaving work for the students to do. Feedback should be more work for the recipient than the donor. So not giving complete solutions. And then finally, retiming the assessment. As I mentioned earlier, in Japan, it's very common for a teacher to give the end of unit test before the end of the unit, and then she has time to use the information. So the big idea here is that as long as feedback is focusing forward, that feedback is collected with a view to what you do with that information immediately to make the learning better, you'll be able to focus the feedback on growth rather than on the negative impacts on students' well-being. Thank you.